You wake up one morning and the coffee maker your spouse ordered has arrived, and it looks nothing like the one you have used for 14 years. And your very first thought, before you have even opened the box, before you have read a single word on the instruction panel, is, "I do not want this." And the intensity of that reaction surprises even you, because you know it is just a coffee maker, and you know the old one was leaking, and you know this is an upgrade in every measurable way. But something in your chest has already tightened around the old machine, the way a hand tightens around a railing when the ground shifts. And what you are feeling in that moment is not stubbornness, and it is not irrationality, and it is not the early signs of someone who cannot keep up with the world anymore. It is the opening note of one of the most powerful and least understood things that happens inside the human mind after 60. And by the time I am done explaining what it actually is and why it exists and what it is protecting, you will never again dismiss it as a small thing, because it is not small. It is enormous, and it has been misread by nearly everyone who has ever watched an older person resist something new and concluded that they were simply being difficult. Let me be direct about something before we go any further, because the story our culture tells about this topic is so deeply wrong that it needs to be corrected at the foundation before anything useful can be said on top of it. The story goes like this. As people age, they become rigid. They become set in their ways. They lose the mental flexibility needed to adapt. And this rigidity is a decline, a deficit, a slow wearing away of the quickness that once let them move through a changing world without friction. This story is told by adult children who are frustrated that their parents will not move to a smaller house, by technology companies that design products assuming older users are simply slower versions of younger ones, by a medical world that treats a preference for routine as something bordering on a problem, and by a culture that worships newness so completely that any resistance to it gets treated as failure. And this story is, at best, a quarter of the truth. At worst, it is a deep misunderstanding of what the older brain is actually doing when it pushes back against change, because what it is doing is not breaking down. It is making a calculation so layered, so deeply connected to identity and memory and the meaning of an entire life, that a younger brain could not perform it even if it wanted to. Here is what is actually happening. As the brain ages, the system responsible for making new things feel exciting and worth pursuing undergoes a real physical change. There is a chemical called dopamine that plays a central role in how the brain responds to anything novel, and the pathway that carries that chemical gradually becomes less active over the course of a lifetime. In a younger brain, encountering something new triggers a strong signal that says, "Pay attention. This is different. This could be valuable. Lean into it." In an older brain, that signal is quieter, not because the brain has forgotten how to learn or how to adapt, but because the chemical infrastructure that once made newness feel automatically rewarding has physically thinned out. The result is that new experiences, new objects, new routines no longer carry the same built-in sense of excitement they once did, which means the brain has to work harder to find a reason to engage with them. And in the absence of a good reason, it naturally defaults to what it already knows and trusts. This is not laziness. This is not decline in the way most people use that word. This is a shift in the brain's internal cost system that makes the familiar easier and cheaper to process and the unfamiliar more effortful and expensive. And your brain, which has been optimizing for efficiency your entire life, responds the way any intelligent system would. It starts spending less on what has become costly and more on what remains affordable. But the brain chemistry only explains the surface. Underneath it, there is something far more powerful and far more personal driving your resistance to change. And it has nothing to do with chemicals and everything to do with who you are. Every routine you have built over decades, every familiar object in your home, Every habitual sequence you perform between waking up and walking out the door is not just a behavior. It is a piece of your identity. It is a physical expression of who you have become over the course of a lifetime. And when someone asks you to change one of those things, they are not just asking you to do something differently. They are asking you to stop being a version of yourself that took 40 years to build. Brain imaging research has shown that the part of the brain most involved in your sense of self, the part that activates when you think about who you are and what you believe and what matters to you, is the same part that activates when you interact with objects and routines you consider yours. Your brain literally processes your morning routine the same way it processes your identity, and disrupting that routine triggers the same kind of internal alarm that would fire if someone challenged a core belief you hold about who you are as a person. When your adult daughter rearranges your kitchen cabinets during a weekend visit, and you feel a flash of something far too intense to be explained by the relocation of plates, that is your brain registering a disturbance to your sense of self, not a domestic inconvenience. And the emotion you are feeling is not about the plates. It is about the fact that someone just edited a piece of your life story without your permission. And there is a layer even deeper than this one, that almost nobody in the popular conversation about aging and change ever reaches. When an older adult encounters something new, their brain does something that a younger brain does not do. It runs the new thing through a background process that asks, how does this fit into the story of who I am and what my life has meant? A 25-year-old sees a new piece of technology and their brain asks, what does this do? A 70-year-old sees the same technology and their brain asks, what does this mean? Does this belong in my world? Does this respect or erase the skills I spent decades building? And if I adopt this, does it mean the way I have been doing things was wrong? And if the way I have been doing things was wrong, then what does that say about all the years I spent doing them that way? That is not rigidity. That is an evaluation process so deeply connected to a lifetime of experience that younger brains are simply not complex enough to run it. And it is the reason a new coffee maker can feel like a philosophical problem, and a new phone can feel like a threat to everything you know about yourself, not because you cannot figure out the buttons, but because your brain is checking the new object against decades of accumulated selfhood before it will agree to let it in. Now let me tell you about the part that changes everything. The part that makes it impossible to look at an older person's resistance to change the same way ever again. One of the most respected frameworks in the history of psychology describes the final emotional task of a long life as a tension between two things: the feeling that your life holds together as something meaningful and whole, even with all its mistakes, and the feeling that too much went wrong and it is too late to repair it. What most people do not realize is that this is not a quiet philosophical exercise that happens in an armchair. It is an active, ongoing daily process in which the brain is constantly checking whether the life it has built still makes sense as a single connected story. Every routine you maintain, every familiar object you keep in its place, every sequence of small habitual acts you perform without thinking, is serving a purpose in this process, because each one is a piece of evidence that your life has continuity, that there is a thread connecting who you were at 30 to who you are at 70, that the decades you invested in becoming this particular person were not wasted. And when change is forced upon you, when a routine is disrupted or a familiar environment is rearranged, or a skill you relied on is made irrelevant by something you never asked for, your brain does not just process a practical adjustment. It processes a potential break in the story that is holding your entire psychological world together. Research has confirmed that older adults who maintain a strong sense of connection between their past and present selves report significantly higher well-being, more resilience when facing loss, and lower rates of despair than those who feel their lives have become fragmented or disconnected from who they used to be. And the routines, the habits, the familiar objects, the unchanged spaces, these are the scaffolding that connection is built on. They are not signs of someone who cannot handle the modern world. They are load-bearing walls in the psychological structure of a life, and asking someone to remove them without understanding what they are holding up is like asking someone to knock out a wall in their house because you think it would look better without it, completely unaware that the ceiling is resting on it. But I want to be honest with you here, because the full picture requires a truth that is harder to sit with but essential to hear. There is a difference between protecting a life you have built and hiding inside a life you are afraid to change, and the line between them is real, even if it is not always easy to see. Healthy protection is what happens when your brain maintains routines and spaces and relationships that hold together a life that still feels meaningful and alive. Unhealthy rigidity is what happens when the fear of any disruption becomes so total that it prevents you from engaging with anything new at all, when the circle of what feels safe shrinks so small that it becomes a cage rather than a home, when the resistance is no longer guarding your identity, but trapping it inside a version of yourself that stopped growing years ago. The way to tell the difference is to ask yourself one honest question, and it is not a comfortable question, but it is the right one. When I say no to something new, am I protecting a life I love, or am I avoiding a grief I have not faced? Because sometimes the resistance to replacing the coffee maker is not really about the coffee maker. It is about the fact that the old one was bought during a chapter of your life that is now over, a chapter that included a person who is gone, or a version of your health that no longer exists, or a feeling of being competent in the world that has quietly slipped away. And that machine sitting on the counter is the last physical ambassador of a time when everything still felt manageable. And replacing it means admitting that the time is past, and admitting that the time is past means grieving it. And grieving it means feeling something your brain has been arranging your entire environment to help you avoid. If that is what is happening, then the answer is not to force the change, and it is not to refuse it forever. The answer is to let the loss be real first, to grieve what needs to be grieved before asking yourself to move through it. Because a brain that is forced to change before it is processed, the loss connected to that change, will fight back with everything it has, and it should, because it is trying to protect something that matters, and what matters deserves to be honored before it is released. The research on this is clear. Older adults who are given the chance to process a transition at their own pace, who are allowed to acknowledge what is being lost before being asked to embrace what is being gained, adapt more successfully and with less emotional distress than those who are pressured to change quickly or told that their resistance is irrational. The brain does not resist change because it cannot handle change. The brain resists change because it needs to run every new thing through a filter that took 70 years to build. A filter that checks each new input against the entire architecture of a self, and that process takes time, and that time is not wasted, and no one, not your children, not your doctor, not a culture obsessed with speed and adaptation, has the right to tell you that your filter is broken just because it works more slowly and more carefully than theirs. So here is what I want you to carry with you the next time someone suggests, with the best of intentions, that you need to be more open to new things. You are not resistant to change because you are old. You are careful about change because you are experienced, because your brain has spent decades building something that works, something that holds your identity in place, something that tells you every morning when you wake up and move through the same familiar sequence of small quiet acts that you are still you, that the life you built is still here, that the world has not yet become so unfamiliar that you cannot find yourself in it. And that carefulness is not a weakness. It is one of the most important achievements of a long life, because it means you have built a self sturdy enough to know what it needs and honest enough to say no to what it does not. The people around you who are frustrated by your resistance do not understand what they are asking you to let go of, because they have not lived long enough to have built what you have built, and they do not yet know what it feels like to protect something that took an entire lifetime to put together. They will someday. And when they do, when they are 70 and someone tries to rearrange the structure of their daily life as though it were nothing, they will understand for the first time that it was never about the coffee maker, and it was never about the phone, and it was never about the floor plan. It was about the self. It was always about the self. And the self, after 7 decades of construction, has earned the right to decide what comes in and what does not, what stays and what goes, what is welcomed and what is, quietly and without apology, declined. That is not rigidity. That is the sovereignty of a life fully lived. And your brain has been building toward it since the day you were born.